So let's jump right in with a massive question. What's the real relationship between the Old and New Testaments? Are they two completely separate books, or are they part of one single continuous story? Well, it turns out the answer might be hiding in plain sight. Now get this. That's a quote from a modern minister, and it really highlights this tension a lot of people feel. This idea that because the New Testament is all about grace, Christians need to kind of, unhitch themselves from all the rules and laws in the Old Testament. In this idea of a great divide, it's everywhere, isn't it? You've probably heard it a million times. The angry, wrathful God of the Old Testament versus the kind, loving Jesus of the New. But is that really the full story? Okay, so this perceived disconnect, it's not just some small theological debate. It actually changes how you read the entire Bible from start to finish. It's the central problem we're going to unpack in this explainer. But here's a wild thought. What if the key to solving this puzzle isn't some new idea we came up with? What if the Bible actually contains its own instruction manual, a guide found deep inside the Old Testament itself that shows us exactly how the New Testament authors read their scriptures? So what we're suggesting here is that the New Testament authors weren't just making things up as they went along. They weren't creating some brand new way to read scripture. No, they were actually continuing a very old, very rich tradition of how Scripture interprets Scripture. You should think of the apostles and the gospel writers as expert-level readers. I mean, they had studied their scriptures, what we now call the Old Testament, so intensely that they learned its internal logic. They weren't inventing new rules. They were just following the patterns they saw right there in the text itself. Now, to really grasp this, we need to think about context a little differently. We need to introduce a new concept, something called vertical context. And trust me, it adds this powerful third dimension to how we read these texts. It's kind of like a conversation that's been happening for centuries, all within the pages of the Bible. A later text doesn't just quote an earlier one, it builds on it, it deepens its meaning, and it carries that meaning forward. Let's see how this works. It's like an interpretive chain reaction. So when Mark describes Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, he isn't just pulling a random quote out of the prophet Zechariah. No way. He's tapping into this incredibly deep vertical context, a whole network of meaning that goes all the way back to a prophecy in the book of Genesis. All right, let's follow another one of these textual trails. It's pretty amazing to see how this conversation unfolds across the entire biblical library. Okay, so we start way back in the Torah, in Deuteronomy. This is foundational stuff. Moses himself sets up this major expectation. He tells the people of Israel, hey, be on the lookout for a future prophet who is going to be like me. And guess what? That was not a forgotten promise. You fast forward hundreds of years, and suddenly, the first followers of Jesus see this ancient expectation coming to life right before their very eyes. And here it is, in the book of Acts, the connection is made crystal clear. The Apostle Peter stands up and quotes that exact passage from Deuteronomy and applies it directly to Jesus. See, he's not inventing a new meaning. He is following an interpretive path that was laid down centuries before. Now, this is so important because it shows us that the New Testament authors were reading Scripture in a very specific way. Their method was totally different from other groups at the time, like the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. They used a line-by-line method called pesher, which was really allegorical, whereas the apostles' approach was selective and grounded in historical events. This is such a great case study. You've got two different groups, the early Christians and the Qumran community, and they both quoted this exact same verse from the prophet Amos, but they used it to argue for completely opposite things. So in the book of Acts, James uses this prophecy to make the case for welcoming non-Jews, Gentiles, into the community. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that very same verse is used to justify excluding foreigners. So what's the difference? Well, James's reading follows the inclusive trajectory that was already there in the prophet's original message, while the other text was, well, reading it against the grain to support their own exclusive ideas. Okay, so we've just done a pretty deep dive into some ancient interpretive methods. You might be asking, why does any of this matter for me right here, right now? Because it reframes everything. All of a sudden, the Bible isn't two separate books with competing, contradictory messages. Instead, it becomes one single unified story that grows and deepens over time, where each part is intentionally and brilliantly building on what came before it. So let's just boil this all down. What are the big takeaways? 1. The biblical authors were master readers of their own scriptures.
2. They understood that God's revelation was a process that unfolded through this interbiblical interpretation. 3. This creates this incredible continuity across the entire Christian Bible. And 4, this is the most important part, it means the Bible itself shows us how to read it. The New Testament authors weren't forcing a new system onto the old texts. They were just continuing the conversation the scriptures themselves had already started.
There's a fantastic quote from the scholar Brevard Childs that just hits the nail on the head. He points out that the first Christians didn't need to edit or change the Old Testament to make it Christian. Why? Because there was no need. They saw their story, the story of Jesus, as the natural, logical continuation and fulfillment of the epic story Israel's scriptures were already telling. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful question. If we start reading the Bible not just as a flat text, but as this dynamic, self-interpreting story, if we follow the patterns it sets out for us, what other hidden connections, what other deeper meanings are just waiting there for us to discover? It gives us a whole new lens to see these ancient foundational texts.